Hello everybody and welcome to the round glass, maybe we should call it hemispherical glass, review for the Nikon 8mm f8 Fisheye Nikkor from 1962 to 1966. This is a special use lens. The manual for this lens indicates that the lens design was for scientific use. For instance, for measuring astronomical object locations, cloud distributions across a whole sky, or measuring the location of objects relative to the zenith. Also, the manual notes, this lens can be used for special effects. As a special note on this, one major difference between this lens, the one in this review, this model lens, and other circular fisheyes, is that magnification with this lens is uniform as objects move across the field, meaning not that the things are the same size, but that they grow and shrink at the same rate as they move across the frame. So this is far from true with many circular fisheyes, especially lower priced models, where with those moving the lens or recording moving objects with that lens shows increases in magnification rates as objects move towards the image's center. The bottom line up front for this lens is that it has some challenges to its use with traditional film cameras specifically. However, mirrorless cameras today reduce those. If you do decide to use this lens, you do want to be careful because the front element can be damaged very easily. It's a fun lens to use, but honestly, if you want a circular fisheye just to shoot with, I suggest avoiding this one and buying a much less expensive brand new option. Leave this lens for the scientists, the collectors, and other people who really have a good use for one that is designed in this lens's specific way. So giving you nothing, quite frankly, that you couldn't figure out on your own by reading about a half dozen different sources online because there's not one that had all of this information. The focal length and AOV are 8mm and 180 degrees on full frame. Now, because I could not find a single APS-C or smaller sensor camera that would mount this lens because of the invasive design and the way that the sensors are held within the mirrorless camera bodies, if there is a smaller than full frame sensor camera that this lens can mount on, I'm unaware of it, so for right now, APS-C and micro four thirds angles of view are pretty much NA. The aperture range is 8 to 22 in full stops with hard detents. Element and group count is 9 elements in 5 groups. For the design, it's a standard ultra-wide fisheye type. It is an invasive design, not a retro-focus design. Filters are NA except for the 6 which come built into it. We'll talk about those later in the video. Closest focus is 50 centimeters, and then it will focus from that point to infinity at f8. The aperture has relatively little effect on the depth of field, mainly serving as exposure control. Now that said, at f22, if you have water drops on the front element of your lens, they will be kind of in focus. The native mount is Nikon F, but as an asterisk, it can only be used with certain bodies on Nikon F that have an MLU. The dimensions are 82mm by 42.5, and it weighs in at 300 grams. My best tip for this lens is that it did not mount on any of my APS-C bodies due to the way that the molding on the inside of the lens mount is shaped. So if you want to use this lens, your best bet is to use it on a full-frame mirrorless body. My next tip: using a macro focusing adapter with this lens is basically pointless. If you rack out the focus on this lens a ½ centimeter-ish, then what's touching the lens is in focus. And it's already possible by stopping down the lens, like I noted, to get water drops and to a lesser extent the dust that's on the lens's front surface in focus. For metering, I used all the modes that were available with my Sony a7S II and found consistently that the large dark area around the image circle does affect metering, which stands to reason and should shock no one at all. But if you shoot raw, it has less of an effect than I would have expected. So what that means is basically that large dark area, the way that your light meter works is it wants to make that just as bright as what's in the center of the frame. So it's going to try to even out the exposure. That's going to lead to you having improper exposure with your images. So one thing you can do is use center-weighted metering with this lens, and that's going to give you an exposure that's much closer to being accurate. I would not recommend using spot metering with this simply because that's going to completely bias the exposure to a very, very small part of the frame. And if you're pointing this with any sort of light, bright light in the frame, that spot meter reading is going to be highly inaccurate. So center weighted really is going to be your best bet. So my next tip is going to be don't shoot in JPEG, shoot RAW, because you will have better exposure control when you go back to edit and you can recover more information. And the last point on metering is this. If you meter improperly, especially if you're using full matrix metering, you can get some odd flaring and ghosting that appears in this large dark space as well. And there are going to be a handful of images in this video that show that. And basically what's happening is that's digital noise in the dark parts of the image that's caused by adjusting exposure in post. My next tip is that this lens reputation as being hard to use on 35mm cameras is honestly, it's bunk. This image from this lens is a circle. If you misalign your camera alignment, all you do in post is just set the center of your crop to the center of the image and then rotate the crop and have the crop, when it crops and gives you your new image, have a black background. And you have fixed the alignment in this image. Okay, but if you're printing in a darkroom, you just turn the easel. So adjusting alignment issues with this lens or any circular fisheye writ large, super easy. My next tip is to make sure you know if this lens can mount on your camera before you use it. A broken mirror is not fun. And the last tip is going to be keep your lens cap on at all times when you are not taking a photo. This is for two reasons. One, it protects the element on the front from damage, which is very important. The second is it protects your camera. With a 180-degree sphere of view, in this lens's image area, the sun is highly likely to be in your field of view at some point, probably close to half the time. Because this lens focuses at infinity always, if the sun gets into your frame, it will be in focus and could either melt or burn a hole in the shutter curtains of your film camera or damage your mirrorless camera sensor. This is a non-retrofocus fisheye ultra-wide lens with filters built into the optical design. Now, this design has a lot of nice refinements and it draws a lot of inspiration from the oldest fisheye lenses, which were first released with the Hill Sky lens in 1923. So this lens came out less than 40 years after the very first 180-degree fisheye lens was released. The design for this lens does bend the light traveling through it a lot, especially at the lens's perimeters. So what I want you to note here is that if you can kind of imagine the way that the light passes through this lens, perimeter light basically makes a 90-degree turn as it's traveling through this lens. And it's pretty amazing how little softness there is with that amount of bending as the light passes through the glass. So for an idea of what some of these filters look like, as I've been talking about this, of course, here is some footage that I recorded showing the filters being rotated in the lens. I'm going to apologize, of course, for the shaky cam with these. I was using a tripod for each sample, but if the filter movement vibrated the physical lens, but also as those filters moved, because they are part of the optical path, they vibrated, for lack of a better term, the light moving through the lens. And so some of the shakiness that you're seeing in these samples is because of the movement of the optical element within the lens. As a reference, here's a table that I made, recreated from the table in the manual with some additional information based on my own experience for using the filters in this lens. Feel free to pause the video here, screen grab, and then unpause so that you can use this information for yourself. This lens comes with 6 filters built into it. L1A is your default ultraviolet filter. Y48 is a medium yellow. Y52 is a deep yellow, O57 is an orange, and R60 is red. Last one, X0, is light green. So basically, most of those filters, the colored ones, while all of them are designed for black and white film use only, they're not designed to be effect filters with color film or on your mirrorless camera. All of them have a different and specific use when it comes to what this lens was designed for. So for instance, the majority of those, the warm tone ones, are used for photographing the sky. So if you're trying to measure the size of clouds, having that added contrast will make it easier to identify the exact perimeter of where the clouds are. Also, those darker ones will allow measurement of things like cirrus clouds, which may not be immediately visible on film or to the naked eye. The light green filter is something that's going to adjust the way that reds and blues look, and to a lesser extent some of the greens, because in nature what we see as green actually has a lot of blue light being reflected from it. So that would be a filter which would be really good for measuring things like forest canopies or foliage in an area. So this is a pretty complex use of this lens, and it's a process which requires a bit of math. I wrote, and in the description there's a link to an article for f-stoppers that explains the process of using this lens in Zenith and spatial relationship calculations. The section here in this video will go over that, not in quite as much detail, and also if you find it easier to understand these concepts when reading them instead of hearing them, I highly recommend checking out that f-stoppers article after this video. Your first step is going to be to take a photo where, ideally, the entire horizon is available. With this, you're going to try to point the center of the lens at the sky's zenith. Step 2 is going to be marking the image's center. Once we know the center of the image circle, the perimeter of the image circle is 12 millimeters from that center at all points around the circle. Step 3, we know that a full-frame image sensor is 24 millimeters high. Coincidentally, and by design, that's the same height as the image circle. So if you take the height of your image in pixels and you have it, that means that the number of pixels are a 12 millimeter line. So let's say that you have a 24 millimeter image circle that is 2400 pixels high. 1200 pixels high is half of that. If you divide 1200 pixels by 12 millimeters, now you know that you have 100 pixels per millimeter. So you divide the number that is half of your image sensor's height in pixels by 12, and you know the number of pixels per millimeter. That lets you create measurement lines on your image for precise measurement. If you know it's 100 pixels per millimeter and you want to measure to half millimeter accuracy, creating a dashed line that is 50 pixels on, 50 pixels off, lets you precisely measure half millimeter increments. Step 4, identify a subject in your image. In this part of the demonstration, we're going to pick the tip of the tree in the upper right quadrant and measure the distance from the image's zenith, which is 10.75 millimeters. For step 5, we're going to refer to the chart in the manual. It's reproduced here, and we can see that a subject of 10.75 millimeters from the image center is approximately 77 degrees from the zenith, and that's based on the chart. That gives us a pretty good range, but we can get a more precise reading if we use the table from the manual. The table indicates that the exact angular distance from the zenith for our tree tip will be 79.845 degrees. And you know what? That 77 degree reading is pretty darn close at a glance. For step 6, let's measure the angular distance between two subjects. And for that, we're going to need the third column of the table. That third column allows us to calculate the angular distance between two objects on the same radial line down to a fractional, a quarter millimeter, with good reliability. The f-stoppers article, by the way, does note that you could, and gives you an idea of how, to calculate the distance, the angular distance of subjects on your image to like a tenth or even smaller fractions of a millimeter. So our seventh step is going to be picking two subjects, and I've picked Abe Lincoln's furrowed brow and some random bit of rock mortar because it was easy to draw a line between those 2 points. Step 8 is going to be measuring the distance between those 2 points. Now, Abe Lincoln's brow is 7.75 millimeters from the zenith, and that little bit of rock mortar is 10.5 millimeters. So we know that the distance between them is just a hair shy of 3 millimeters. So the last step is going to be to use the third column in the table. We start counting the angular distance in the third column at the 7.75 millimeter mark, and then tally all of those little angular divisions for each half millimeter until we get to 10.5. The starting point, because it's 7.75 millimeters, is halfway between 7.5 and 8, so we cut that figure in half. That gives us a total angular separation between the two subjects that we picked of 21.035 degrees. That's a pretty accurate reading. So almost everything in the outline for this section is NA because this lens has no focus to worry about. It does have an aperture with full stop detents, and they are pretty strong detents, at least on mine. If you want a circular fisheye lens for stepless aperture use, this is not your lens. Don't modify one of these, just buy something else. In terms of video use, with the right subject and setting, this lens could be useful for interesting and creative effects. Not easy to use, but interesting. So if you are hell-bent for leather on using this lens for video, here are 4 tips that will help you make the most out of it. First tip, don't pan unless you really want to create a disorienting effect. The magnification changes across the frame will potentially give your viewers motion sickness, or at least that is to say, it gives me motion sickness and I don't get motion sickness. Second is tilting up and down will severely distort horizontal lines and warp your scene a lot. My third tip is that you can stop down the aperture with this lens during recording if you are careful and if you have everything well secured, but any flare and star points will change in your scene, and that can be distracting, especially when the source point light stars rotate. Walking with this lens in your video could be an interesting effect and look, however, as opposed to panning and tilting, that is. So there may be some use for this lens in video other than planting it in a stationary location and hoping that you're not in the frame. For sharpness, around the periphery this lens is soft, but given that I honestly expected the entire thing to be kind of soft and it's not, I'm really pleased by the way this lens performs. This is a much sharper lens than I expected given the extreme focal length and the optical design's age. The build quality is very good, the lens is solid. There is of course the huge risk to the front element anytime you have the lens cap off. There's no way around that, so just keep your lens cap on when you're not using this lens. For contrast, it is excellent, and that translates as well into how this lens renders colors. It's a slightly warm lens, which is kind of a little bit different than a lot of the same vintage Nikon lenses I've been using. And it also provides really fantastic image contrast. Your aperture is stepped with 6 blades. Your out of focus area really, honestly, unless you're using a macro focus adapter, there's nothing out of focus with this lens, so there's no real out of focus area characteristics. And as noted, macro focus adapters don't give you really anything you want with this lens anyway. For distortion, this lens makes no effort not to distort lines, right? Ooh, well, no, that's a wrong statement about this lens, and basically, insofar as I know, all well-corrected circular fisheye lenses. If you draw a straight line to connect 2 antipode points on the image periphery, there are infinite ones to choose from, that line will be straight no matter where those points are in relationship to the image periphery. So, the lens has near perfect radial symmetry from the optical center. So in more technical terms, distortion occurs when lines are parallel to the film plane, which is to say orthogonal to the lens's optical center line. Distortion does not occur when lines are parallel to the lens's optical center line. Put simply, This lens does not distort radially, but it does distort rectilinearly. Light loss is minimal given the amount of bending that light has to do in this lens, and I think that likely owes to the small minimum aperture. Illumination does improve as the aperture stops down, but not meaningfully. Your balance with cameras is generally going to be fine. This lens is pretty well balanced for cameras being invasive because it does have glass and metal that protrudes into the camera's shutter box, so that really changes the center of gravity for this lens. It will work well and feel fairly well balanced with either a full-frame mirrorless camera or a heavy vintage Nikon film SLR. This is a lens that, in good conscience, I cannot recommend you buy for the purpose of using. There are many other circular fisheye lenses on the market that can, and honestly should, be used before this one. This is a rare collector's lens designed for a specific scientific purpose. Anything else is, just kind of fun and a byproduct of the intended design. Ultimately, this is the one-trickest of one-trick ponies. It was designed for a specific use, which is measuring things' angular distances, and while it can, yes, do other things, they really are not the wheelhouse. What this lens does, though, is make photography super easy. Just point it in a direction, take a photo, and roll with the results. But again, there are myriad other options on the market for doing that. They're also of newer designs and with faster apertures. Those newer lenses, by the way, they're expendable. These lenses are not. But if you do want to use this lens, or I guess really any circular fisheye lens writ large, there are some best practices for it. Firstly, try to keep your lens level and keep the horizon either in the image center or on the image periphery. The former alignment will minimize your horizon distortion, and the latter will replicate how this lens was designed to be used. So maybe the best thing I can say for this lens is that circular fisheyes aren't easy to use. They are easy to use, but they're not easy to use correctly. If you want to use a circular fisheye lens, however, embrace the look it gives you. Embrace the way that it does distort images, and use it in different ways than you would normally use a lens. Hold it at different angles. Shoot different subjects. Experiment. There's no need to get this specific lens. Save your money. Buy a circular fisheye that's way cheaper and enjoy it instead. The Nikon 8mm f8 fisheye Nikkor, these are museum pieces.